Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the very strange story of Margaret Lennox and the murder of John Lennox, which took place in North Shields in 1847. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I do hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. There is very little information about the backstory of either of those involved in this week's case, so the details will be quite basic. Margaret Lennox was born in around 1791 and was said to be around 56 years old at the time the crime was committed. Her place of birth and parents are unknown. She lived with her husband in North Shields, and it was said that she had been married to John Lennox for around 34 years. And she was described as having recently become quite addicted to the drink. John Lennox, the victim, was also said to be born in around 1791 and was said to be about 56 years old, the same as his wife, at the time of his death. However, I do feel that I should mention that a lot of the news articles describe him as being 67 years old, but the 1841 census has him listed as being 50 years old. So I have mainly used that as a guide to his age, as I know the papers often did make mistakes with their reporting details, but I have to admit to not being entirely sure which one of these dates and ages is correct. His place of birth and parents are unknown, and he had married Margaret at Christ Church in North Shields in around 1813, and the couple had at least 3 known children together. John had previously served as a sailor in the Navy, where he had left after 11 years' service. He had been in an accident and received a pension of £8 per year, but it was said that it was his bowel condition and not the accident that had caused him to leave the Navy. He was described as being a quiet, sober man who at times found it difficult to live with his wife when she was drinking. On Saturday, July the 3rd, John had gone to work early in the morning as usual. He was working as a scullerman and was most likely taking people and items from one side of the Tyne to the other. At around 8:30 a.m. he returned to his home in North Shields for his breakfast, which his wife Margaret had prepared for him. After this he returned to work and continued with his daily job without any problems before returning home once again for his lunch. Once more, this was a meal that his wife had prepared for him, and it was something that he had asked her to make, and he and the family sat together and all ate the same food. However, this time, on his return to work, he began to complain to those around him that he did not feel very well, eventually having to return home and take to his bed. He became a lot worse quite quickly with sickness and diarrhea, and a doctor was sent for. However, John died around 5 minutes before the doctor was able to see him. At first, there appeared to be no suspicious circumstances surrounding the death of John Lennox, as it had been known that he had previously suffered ill health. However, in the following couple of days, it became known that Margaret had been identified as someone who had bought arsenic from a local chemist shop on the day that John had died, and suspicions were aroused that she had been involved in his death. And because the police were made aware of this, Margaret was arrested and charged with the willful murder of her husband, and was taken to the Tynemouth House of Correction, where she would remain until the inquest. The inquest was held at the Northumberland Arms in North Shields before Coroner Reid. It is not known who had identified the body of John Lennox. However, as he did have grown children, it is possible that it would have been one of them. William Hunter said he was an apprentice in a chemist shop in North Shields, and on Saturday morning, the 3rd of July, sometime between 10 and 11 a.m, he said he had served a woman with 2 pennies worth of arsenic, which she had asked him to mix with some lard. Excuse me, lost my voice there. He said he had asked her what the poison was for, and she said it was to kill some bugs in her house. He said he then mixed the poison in the greasy substance that the woman had brought in with her and placed it in a packet and labelled it poison. He said he had never seen the woman before. William Williamson said he was also an apprentice in the same shop, and he was present when the woman had come in to buy the poison. He said he knew the woman, and she was Margaret Lennox. And after this, his evidence was the same as William Hunter's. Jane Liddell said she was a widow and lived in the house next to the Lennox family in North Shields. She said that on Friday, July the 2nd, Margaret had spoken to her and told her that the family had all been ill, and on the following afternoon she said John's daughter had come to her house to seek her help, having told her that her father was now much worse. Jane said she went to their house and found John sitting on the bedside. He had been sick and did not look very good. He had been helped into bed, and Dr. Fenwick had been sent for. She added that John had been ill on and off for some time, as he had a bowel complaint, and Dr. Fenwick had been treating him, but he had been somewhat better in recent months. She said that the doctor arrived at around 6:30 p.m, however by then John had already died, around 5 minutes before the doctor arrived. She continued by saying that Margaret had told her the whole family had been ill again since breakfast, and that she herself had only just got out of bed to help her husband. She said Margaret had told her they had used Indian meal in their food as it was cheaper than flour. Indian meal was apparently a kind of corn maize meal that was imported from America. It was said that when first imported in the early 1800s there had been difficulties in grinding it, resulting in poorly refined meal, which could mean people eating it would suffer from digestive problems. But this was later resolved. But perhaps this was mentioned as an indication that Margaret felt this had made the whole family unwell. Jane also added that Margaret had been addicted to drink for some time, or so she had been told, and she believed that she had been before the magistrates in the past and had been sent to the House of Correction, but she was not sure what she had been to court for, but she understood that it might have been something to do with stolen clothes. Margaret Lennox then made a statement herself. She said that John was her husband and had previously been a sailor, but for some time now he had plied a sculler boat on the river. He had been in bad health for around a year and a half, as he had a bowel complaint. She said Dr. Fenwick had been treating him for this, but he had not taken any medication for some time. She said on Friday, July the 2nd, he had complained of feeling unwell and he had been sick. She said he complained again of feeling unwell before having his breakfast on the Saturday morning, but he went to work as usual, and when he came home for his lunch, he said he was still unwell and had a bad taste in his mouth. However, she said he still had his lunch, which was a small light pudding made with more of the Indian meal, and she said the whole family had the same pudding. John again went back to his job as a scullerman, and she said he did mention once again that he did not feel too good, and at around 2:30 p.m. she said he returned home, saying he was now much worse. Margaret said at this time she had been in bed unwell herself, but she had got up to help him to get into bed. John, she said, was in and out of bed with the sickness and diarrhoea, and at 3 p.m. Dr. Fenwick was sent for, but he did not get there until 6:30 p.m, and John had died just a few minutes before he arrived. Margaret then stated that she had been ill herself since breakfast that day and had been in and out of bed with the sickness. She had not gone further than the back door all morning, saying she had not gone to the shops as she was too ill to do so. She also added that she had not seen any bugs in the house that needed to be killed. Margaret said that on Friday morning between 10 and 11 a.m. she had been to New Quay in North Shields to buy a few items, and it was here that she had met a man on horseback. He had called her over and asked her to buy him some fat and some arsenic. She said he told her he wanted it to kill some mice at his stables. She said she did as he asked and then gave him the parcel and he left. She believed he had not been able to get the horse along to the shops and this was why he had asked her to go for him, and she said she would not know the man if she saw him again. And she ended by saying that she was sure that this had happened on Friday and not on the Saturday. William Williamson was then recalled and he identified Margaret as being the woman who had bought the arsenic and fat from his master's shop on the Saturday morning. John Arkle said he lived in North Shields and that William Williamson was his nephew. He said on Saturday William told his aunt that Margaret had been in the shop buying arsenic to mix in with the lard. He said William had called her drunken Peggy Lennox, and his wife Elizabeth confirmed the statement her husband had made. John Stoddart said he had a grocery shop in North Shields. He said he had known Margaret and he had sold her some Indian meal on July the 2nd. He said he had also sold some to several other people and had used some himself. He had heard of no one complaining of illness after they had eaten it, and he said that all of his family had been perfectly fine. Marmaduke Marr said a woman who he now knew to be Margaret Lennox had come into his shop on Saturday, July the 3rd in North Shields, asking to buy some arsenic to poison some rats. He said he told her he did not sell it and sent her to the chemist. He then identified Margaret as being the woman who had been in his shop that morning. Dorothy Bruce said she lived in North Shields and had known Margaret for around 12 months. She said she did not think Margaret was addicted to drink, but she said she did smell a drink on her whenever she came to visit, and she said Margaret visited her almost every day. Now I have to admit to a wry smile here, as she kind of did confirm that Margaret drank a lot if she could smell drink on her almost every day. She said that on Saturday, July the 3rd, she had seen Margaret in the shop at around 11 a.m. She said she'd been buying some milk. Anne Dick said she had a stall at Newquay in North Shields, and she said on Saturday, July the 3rd, Margaret had been to her stall, but she did not buy anything. She said she knew Margaret by sight, and it had definitely been her at the stall that morning. John Heel said he was a dockkeeper at Smithstock in North Shields. He said he had known John Lennox for around 7 years. He said he'd been working with him from June the 29th until July the 3rd, and during that time he believed that John Lennox had been in good health. He said he had arrived for work at 6 a.m. on the Saturday morning as usual and did not complain of feeling unwell. He said, in fact, that John Lennox did not complain at all that day until after he returned from his lunch. He said it was around 1:30 p.m. when John Lennox returned, and he was only back around 10 minutes before saying he felt sick and dizzy, so much so that he had to lean on one of the other workers for support. He said he told him to go and sit down to see if it would ease off, but it didn't, and John said he would have to go home. He said he did not see him again, and he later learned that he had died at around 6:30 p.m. that night. Dr. Coward said he was a surgeon at North Shields and he had performed the post-mortem on the body of John Lennox. He said from the speed at which the illness began and the symptoms described, he felt that John had been poisoned with something, but at the time of the post-mortem he had not been able to say what, but he believed this had been the cause of death. He said apart from the remains of his last meal, the stomach had contained something which looked like fat and also a yellowish powder in the lining of the membrane of the stomach. He said the contents had been sent for examination. Dr. Fenwick of North Shields said he had also been present at the post-mortem, and he agreed with his colleague that death had been caused by John ingesting some kind of irritable poison. Dr. Glover of Newcastle said he had examined the contents of the stomach in much closer detail, and from his tests he had determined that arsenic had been present in the stomach of John Lennox. He said taking into account that John had been suffering from sickness, he still believed there had been sufficient arsenic present to have caused his death. The coroner then summed up the case to the jury, stating that this was indeed a very serious case and needed their careful consideration. There was strong suspicion that the deceased's own wife was involved in his death, and if they felt there was enough evidence for this, then they must find her guilty of wilful murder. It had been proven that Margaret had bought arsenic and that this had also been found in John's body. He did not appear to suggest any other verdict to the jury. The jury retired for 30 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder against Margaret Lennox, and she was committed for trial and removed to the House of Correction in Tynemouth. Later that day, Margaret would be sent to Morpeth Prison, where she would remain until her trial took place. I did not find any evidence of a funeral for John Lennox. It is possible that the funeral was not reported, as it is known that he was buried in the local area, and obviously he did have family who would hopefully have taken care of his funeral. As Preston Cemetery did not open until 1856, it is possible that he would have been buried in the churchyard of Christ Church in North Shields. The trial took place in early August of 1847. No location is given, and Margaret pleaded not guilty to the charge of murder. The majority of the evidence was the same as that given at the inquest, so I will only add the new evidence here. Anna Mavin said she was the daughter of John and Margaret Lennox. She said she lived in the same house. She said she had been present when all of the meals had been made on the 3rd of July, and she had also eaten the same food as her father. She said her father had returned home around 2:30 p.m. complaining of feeling very ill and took to his bed. She said that her mother had wanted to send for a doctor at that time, but her father would not allow it. She said her father was often ill and had powders in his room that he would take, but she was not sure if he had taken any that day. She said the doctor was not sent for till around 5 p.m. Now it is worth a quick mention here that Margaret herself had said the doctor was sent for at 3 p.m. And she said when he was sick that day her mother had been very kind to him, and she had also been very distressed when he had died. She continued by saying that she had gone for the doctor herself, but it had been a long wait to see him, and by the time he returned to the house with her, her father was already dead. She said her mother had been ill that same day, also being sick, and she said she herself had also been sick that morning, but she did not mention if any of the children had been sick. Dr. Fenwick was recalled, and he said that he had first met John in April of 1846. He said he had complained of diarrhea that he had been suffering with for some time. He said he treated him for around 17 days, and then John said that he was well and did not need any more treatment. He said he had not seen him again until the day he went to the house when John had died. He did not know if he had suffered any further problems during this time, but he had certainly not been sent for. There are no details of anything that the prosecution had said about the case. The defence stated that there was no real proof that John Lennox had died of arsenic poisoning, and even if that had been the cause of death, there was no proof that Margaret had given it to him. She had eaten all the same food as he had, and also in the house that day there were her daughter and 2 grandchildren who also ate and drank the same food, so would have been in great danger of death had Margaret poisoned this food. He also stated that Margaret had wished to send for a doctor immediately and had taken great care of her husband, as had been stated in the evidence of her daughter. She had also been quick to send for the neighbour to help her, and had not just left her husband to suffer. The defence ended his statement by saying that just because poison had been present in the body of John Lennox did not mean that it had been Margaret who had given it to him. How it got there he was unable to say. Perhaps John had taken it by accident, as accidents did happen. He said the couple had lived together happily for over 30 years, and Margaret had no motive for wishing her husband's death, as this would have left her without any means of support. The judge then summed up the details of the case, stating it was for the jury to decide if this had been a case of wilful murder, or if, as the defence had suggested, this was just some mysterious accident with no way of knowing how the arsenic had got into the body of John Lennox. The jury retired for over an hour before returning a verdict of not guilty, and Margaret Lennox was then free to go. I did not find any further details of what happened to Margaret after this date. Now, I often say these cases are strange ones, and if any of the cases deserve that title more than others, then this is certainly one of them. I cannot really understand why Margaret was found not guilty and discharged, when I personally found her story of the man on the horse wanting her to buy arsenic from him very unbelievable. And also her story of not being out on the Saturday seemed to have been disproven by several people who said they had seen her at the local shops, and it was really only her daughter who claimed that she had also been ill on the day of her husband's death and had not been out. And the suggestion that someone would not have poisoned food that everyone is going to eat is not necessarily true, as John, being someone who was already prone to sickness, may have only needed a very small amount to make him seriously ill, whereas others in the home may have only suffered with a small amount of sickness and quickly recovered. Of course, we do have to consider the fact that Margaret did not seem to have any reason for wanting her husband dead. There was no mention of insurance money, no mention of ill treatment, or that he was a drinker. In fact, from evidence given, it was Margaret that was the drinker, not her husband. However, I do still feel that some of the story leaves me thinking she had more to do with his death than the jury thought. Maybe it was even just the simple fact that she did not like him complaining about her drinking, and that had annoyed her enough to not want him around anymore, as we know from many of these stories, people in the past did commit murder for some very, very strange reasons. And I think perhaps she maybe should have been found guilty of manslaughter. But what do you think? Do you think Margaret really did meet a man on a horse who asked her to buy arsenic? Or do you think she had planned to poison her husband for reasons unknown? Do you think the jury was right to find her not guilty? Or should she have been found guilty of manslaughter at the very least? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very strange, sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.